She walked into the courtroom to testify, but no one realized she was actually there to expose the same corrupt cop who destroyed her life years ago. Can one woman armed only with silence and the truth bring down the system that once buried her? If stories like this move you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories. Now let's step inside that courtroom and see what really happened. It was a cold morning in Richmond, the kind where the sky hangs low and gray like it's holding its breath. Inside courtroom 3B, the air was stale with routine. People filed into wooden benches, coats still buttoned, whispering half-hearted guesses about what today's case might bring. The hum of quiet anticipation filled the space, broken only by the clatter of heels, the creak of benches, and the rustling of paper. No one was looking for justice. Most were just looking to finish their day. Near the front, the bailiff cleared his throat and motioned toward the defense table. A white man in uniform leaned back in his chair like he owned the place. Officer Logan Reese, late 40s, thick jaw, silver buzz cut, and that sharp, effortless confidence that comes from knowing the system rarely punishes men like him. He wasn't just used to the courtroom. He enjoyed it. It was his playground. Then the door at the back opened quietly, and in stepped a black woman. She didn't walk with power. She didn't look important. She wore a plain gray cardigan, black slacks, and shoes that had seen a few too many winters. Her hair was pulled back neatly, face bare of makeup. No entourage, no clipboard, just a quiet presence, as if she had come from a waiting room no one else had noticed. Officer Reese glanced over and snorted. Looks like someone lost their mop. A few scattered chuckles rippled through the room. He didn't stop there. Leaning toward the prosecutor beside him, he added loud enough for half the courtroom to hear, "Hope she brought her green card. This ain't immigration court." That was when the real laughter started. Not booming or cruel, just that casual kind of mean laughter, the kind that makes people glance around before joining in. The judge hadn't even entered the room yet. This was just Reese being Reese. But the woman didn't flinch. She walked to the front row of the gallery and sat down, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't glance his way, didn't return the insult, just turned her face slightly toward the flag in the corner of the room and closed her eyes for a moment as if letting the silence settle. Officer Reese rolled his eyes and turned back to his file, mumbling something about housekeeping staff wandering into court. The bailiff made no move. The gallery, now quiet again, returned to its own low murmurs. But if anyone had paid attention, really paid attention, they would have noticed something strange. Not fear, not anger, just the steady calm of a woman who had already survived worse than a cruel joke. What they didn't know was that she wasn't a stranger to this courtroom, and she definitely wasn't here to clean the floors. She had walked into this building before. Once a long time ago, through that same side door, hands cuffed, reputation shattered. Back then, there had been no laughter, only silence. Silence from the judge, silence from the attorney who barely looked at her, and silence from the officer who had lied under oath. That officer's name had been Logan Reese. He didn't recognize her now. Not yet. She'd made sure of that. Time had given her new edges, a softer voice, a quieter strength, and she had returned to this courtroom not as a defendant, not as a victim, and not even as a witness in the way the docket claimed. She had returned with a purpose, a mission that went deeper than testimony and ran longer than one trial. Because while Reese had been moving through the years with the ease of a man untouchable, she had been watching, listening, and preparing. Not for revenge, but for something he'd never see coming. From the outside, it looked like she had just taken a seat among the public. But from that first moment, Naomi Carter had taken back the room. She didn't need the judge's permission. She didn't need a badge or a title. All she needed was for him to keep talking. Because the louder he laughed, the more she would let the truth write itself. And the truth was about to walk straight into the daylight, not with fury, but with quiet, unshakable intent. Because today he wasn't mocking a stranger. He was mocking his reckoning, and she was already here. Naomi sat still on the wooden bench, eyes steady on the judge's bench, but her mind had slipped away from the present. The courtroom faded. The chatter, the chairs, the faint echo of Reese's voice, all of it dissolved into silence. In its place rose another room, another courtroom, and another version of herself, standing under the same kind of fluorescent light, too bright and too cold. She had been 23. Young, brilliant, and ambitious enough to think that being smart and right would always be enough. She was finishing her final year at Howard Law with a full scholarship, interning at the public defender's office, and dreaming of one day standing in court to fight for the forgotten. She believed justice had a voice. She believed truth would win eventually always. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late. She was driving home after a long shift, her badge still clipped to her purse folders of client notes on the passenger seat. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't swerving, just tired. The flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror didn't scare her at first. But something about the way the officer approached her window felt different. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't explain why he stopped her. He just asked for her license, then told her to step out of the car. When she calmly asked why, his voice sharpened. The second time she asked, his hands were already pulling the door open. That officer was Logan Reese, and within moments she was face down on the hood, wrists burning in cold metal cuffs, her face pressed against the car she had legally paid for. The police report that followed painted her as aggressive, non-compliant, and violent. They claimed she struck the officer, sprained his wrist. There were no videos submitted as evidence. The only story that made it into the courtroom was his. The judge presiding over her case, Judge Terrence Miles. The same man now seated across the courtroom today, older, but with that same expressionless, impenetrable face. Back then, he hadn't looked at her once. He read her sentence like reading off a receipt, as if her life were nothing more than a tally on his docket. She lost everything. Her scholarship was revoked, her academic status suspended, her internship quietly ended without explanation. Friends stopped returning her calls. Her mentor advised her to lay low for a while. Headlines didn't ask for her version. They just ran with it, promising law student charged with assaulting officer. And then came the long silence. She didn't leave her apartment unless she had to. She didn't return messages because there weren't any. She sat in that quiet space for months, surrounded by law books that no longer meant anything, and a navy blue blazer she hadn't worn since her arrest. But grief isn't static. It shifts. Some days it sits heavy in your bones. Other days it comes out as fire. Naomi had once believed the truth needed only to be spoken. That day she learned the system doesn't always care who tells the truth. It cares who has the microphone. And in that courtroom, she'd been given none. So she made herself a promise. Not revenge, not anger, just clarity. She would return not to reopen her own case, but to uncover the pattern, because she wasn't the first and she knew she wouldn't be the last. There were too many like her. Quiet names buried under bad paperwork, careless hearings, and unchecked authority. If she stayed silent, their stories would stay buried too. She changed her name, moved states, rebuilt from scratch, took jobs beneath her qualifications, waited, listened, watched. For years, she lived with a quiet flame that never went out. And now she had returned. Not as the broken girl in the courtroom shadow, not as the headline, but as the one who had turned every silence into strategy, every insult into patience, every year of isolation into preparation. She wasn't here to tell her story. She was here to finish it. And this time, no one was going to talk over her. Behind every silent move Naomi made that morning, there were others moving with her. Quietly, deliberately. In the background of this case, far from the gavel and the jury box, a different courtroom was forming, one without robes or witnesses, but no less real. This one lived in the shadows of bureaucracy, buried under paper trails, hidden in encrypted messages and burner phones. It was the Department of Justice's Division of Civil Rights, a special task group that didn't wear suits into courtrooms, but carried badges behind locked doors. And at the heart of it all was Naomi. She wasn't just here to watch Reese stumble. She was here as part of something bigger, an ongoing investigation into the culture of abuse, coercion, and cover-ups inside the Richmond Police Department. And she wasn't alone. Downstairs, 2 floors below the courtroom, in a small conference room with no windows, Maya Ellis sat hunched over a case file thick with affidavits and sealed transcripts. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through a photocopied statement from a community activist. Her role was clear: assistant district attorney assigned to monitor the hearing upstairs and quietly report back if anything seemed irregular. She knew the courtroom players by name. She knew the timeline. But what she didn't know, what no one in the Richmond courthouse knew, was that the woman in the gray sweater sitting in the gallery wasn't just another witness. Maya didn't know Naomi's real name or her history. She only knew that someone from Washington had flagged this case and asked her to keep an eye out for inconsistencies, especially around Officer Reese's testimony. She'd been told this was routine oversight, but Maya had prosecuted enough to sense there was more brewing than she was being told. That hunch deepened when the door to the side office clicked open and in walked Isaiah Brooks. Tall, broad, face aged by experience more than years. He carried a small box under one arm and a folder in the other. No badge, no uniform, just the look of a man who had once worn both and now walked alone. Isaiah was a former Richmond police officer, a good one by all accounts, until he'd filed a report accusing several colleagues, including Reese, of tampering with evidence. 3 weeks later, his locker was cleaned out, his pension under review, and his name smeared across department gossip like spilled ink. But Isaiah never stopped collecting, never stopped watching. And now, all those years later, he handed Maya a flash drive and said, "It's time." She clicked it in. Static then voices, male, confident, slurred just enough to guess alcohol was involved. "You remember that girl, the one with the lawyer internship? Man, she thought she was going to be a prosecutor." I shut that down quick. A laugh pinned her with a resisting charge. Judge didn't blink. Saved my neck too. Internal Affairs was sniffing around that week. Another voice chimed in. "You serious?" Serious enough to sleep like a baby that night. The recording ended. Silence filled the room. Maya's stomach turned. "That's Reese," Isaiah said quietly. The night after her sentencing. He thought it was funny. Maya looked at him, then back to the screen. "Why now?" Before Isaiah could answer, Naomi entered the room. She stood by the door, calm as ever. Maya looked at her confused. She hadn't even realized Naomi was part of the inner circle. Isaiah gave Naomi a slow nod. She walked over to the table, then eyes on the flash drive, then up at Maya. "Don't submit it yet," Naomi said softly. Maya blinked. "Why not? That recording alone could..." Naomi's voice was quiet, but her words were iron. "I want them to show their true face first." She leaned closer. "People like Reese, they don't fall because we say they're guilty. They fall because they prove it themselves in public, where the world can see, not through a whisper, through a spotlight." She looked back at the door toward the courtroom. Let him talk, let him lie, let him dig the hole himself. Then she turned to Isaiah. "Thank you for keeping it all this time." Isaiah gave her a quiet nod. "I knew one day you'd come back." And she had. But not as the student he once saw in that courtroom, shaking and silent. Now she was the one calling the shots. And the reckoning she promised was only just beginning. The second day of the hearing broke with a pale morning light that barely touched the courthouse windows. Inside, the walls held onto a kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather. It was the kind that lived in places where stories like Naomi's had been silenced for years. Maya Ellis arrived early, case folder under one arm. Her mind still tangled in the weight of the recording Isaiah had given her the night before. She hadn't listened to it again. She didn't need to. It had already sunk beneath her skin. But what kept her up wasn't the voice on the tape. It was the woman who had calmly told her not to use it yet. Naomi. She was already in the courtroom, same spot as yesterday, still watching, like she was waiting for something no one else could see. Maya hesitated, then walked over and sat beside her. "You're not who you say you are," she said under her breath. Naomi didn't turn to face her. Her gaze remained fixed on the front of the room. "I never said who I was," she replied, voice soft. Then after a pause, "I've been here before. I know how this ends. Unless someone rewrites the script." Maya didn't respond. But she noticed the way Naomi's eyes didn't blink when the judge entered, as if nothing about this moment was surprising, as if she'd already lived it. Judge Terrence Miles called the room to order, with the practiced ease of someone too comfortable in his seat. Naomi watched him closely, every nod, every glance, every interruption. She saw the way he leaned forward slightly when Reese took the stand, just enough to show interest, not enough to call attention. She noted the subtle tightening in his mouth when the defense asked their first question. And when Reese began recounting his version of events, Miles let him speak uninterrupted. Not a single objection was sustained in favor of the defense. Reese painted the picture well. Calm, rehearsed. He spoke of safety concerns, described Naomi's demeanor as erratic, said his actions were necessary. His words were crisp, sanitized. He didn't stumble. But his confidence, that casual smugness, was unmistakable. Naomi remembered it. It hadn't changed in 10 years. To most, it would sound convincing. To Maya, now watching with clearer eyes, it started to feel too neat. Naomi said nothing. Her body still, her breathing even. But in her silence, she was absorbing everything. Every phrase, every glance, every decision. Then out in the quiet quarters of power, someone else was watching. Clifford Rowe, the state's attorney general. Years ago, when Naomi had filed her final appeal, it was Rowe's office that denied it. He didn't need to meet her. Didn't even read the case himself. just glanced at the file, stamped it, and handed it back down the chain. No merit for review, and the door closed. But this morning a name caught his attention in a case brief from Richmond, a familiar one. Naomi Carter, sitting quietly in the courtroom, listed only as a witness. Rowe stood by his window, coffee in hand, scanning the report. Something itched at the back of his mind. He didn't remember her face exactly, but the way her name sat beside Officer Logan Reese's, it stirred something. Years of bureaucracy had taught him that power doesn't always need to hide. Sometimes it just waits. Back in the courtroom, Maya leaned slightly toward Naomi again. What exactly are you planning? Naomi's eyes didn't move from the front of the room. Justice, she said softly, but the kind that doesn't knock, the kind that walks in. She finally turned to face Maya, voice even. Let them lie. Let them get comfortable. Power always tells on itself when it thinks no one's watching. Maya sat back quiet. And for the first time since this hearing began, she started seeing not just a courtroom, but a stage. And Naomi wasn't the audience. She was the one writing the ending. Some battles aren't fought with guns or gavels. They're fought in whispers, in headlines, in the dark rooms where silence is currency and old files are weapons. It didn't take long for Clifford Rowe to find what he was looking for. The name Naomi Carter lit up like a warning flare the moment he connected it to Reese. The more he read, the clearer it became she wasn't there by accident. She was deliberate, patient, dangerous. He didn't panic. Men like him didn't need to. He simply looked at his assistant, handed over an old manila folder with Naomi's name on it, and said, "Make it loud." By noon, a string of anonymous leaks reached local press outlets. One by one, the headlines rolled out like dominoes. Surprise witness in police brutality case has criminal record. DOJ insider. Once convicted for assaulting officer. Can the justice system rely on someone who tried to beat it? They didn't need to lie. All they had to do was tell a version of the truth with just enough venom to stain everything it touched. Back at the courthouse, Maya was in the hallway when her phone buzzed. She opened the article, read the headline once, then again, slower. Her face tightened, her fingers clenched around the phone like it might shatter. Inside, Naomi sat calmly on a bench, her back straight, hands resting in her lap. Maya walked in and stood in front of her. The anger in her voice trembled beneath the surface. You knew this would come out. You knew, and you let me walk into this blind. Why didn't you tell me? Naomi looked up, her expression unreadable. I didn't come here to be trusted, she said. I came here to be heard. There was no apology in her voice, no plea for forgiveness, only a quiet resolve shaped by years of being silenced. Maya stared at her for a long moment. She wanted to say more, wanted to scream, but something in Naomi's eyes stopped her. Something older than pain, something steadier than fear. Minutes later, a federal order came through. Naomi was to be temporarily suspended from direct involvement with the case. To maintain integrity and public perception, they said. Just like that, she was removed from the courtroom. Her seat empty, her name reduced to a shadow behind a scandal. But she didn't fight it. She didn't flinch. Because Naomi had always known the system wouldn't protect her. It never had. And while others scrambled to control the narrative, she simply moved back into the shadows where she worked best. She wasn't done. They had just told the world exactly how scared they were of her. The restaurant was the kind that didn't list prices on the menu, where the music was just soft enough to mask hard conversations. Naomi walked in with steady steps, eyes scanning everything, once not out of intimidation, but habit. A habit built from too many rooms like this. Too many games dressed as dinners. Rowe was already seated at a corner table facing the entrance. His smile was waiting before she arrived. Miss Carter, he greeted, standing slightly. You look composed as always. Naomi sat without offering a smile back. I didn't come here to exchange pleasantries, Mr. Rowe. Fair enough, he said, chuckling as he motioned for the waiter. Still, I appreciate you coming. Shows you are willing to talk. I'm willing to listen, she replied. For now. He nodded, lifting a glass of red wine to his lips. Then let's not waste the moment. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping to that quiet, careful tone men in power always used when they thought they were making history. I see a future for you, Naomi. One with less risk, more respect. A state-level legal advisor position is opening next quarter. It hasn't been posted yet. But with the right conversation, it could be yours. Naomi didn't speak. She let him fill the silence. You've made quite the name for yourself. Headlines, whispers, and from what I hear, certain files that were meant to stay buried are getting unburied. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. That kind of momentum is dangerous for you, For the institutions we both rely on. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Is that your concern? Institutions? Roe leaned back as if settling into a familiar rhythm. My concern, he said slowly, is legacy. Yours is fragile. And if you push too far, the same system you're trying to fix will break you instead. Again. She met his gaze calm, then let it break. I'm not afraid of starting over. He paused. His next words came sharper. You should be. Because next time there won't be anything left to rebuild from. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. This is an agreement of intent, nothing binding, just a signal of where you want to go next. He slid it across the table. Take it, and the story ends quietly. You walk out with a title, not a target on your back. Naomi looked down at the paper, then back at him. You think this is about survival, she said softly. But it's not. Not for me. She leaned forward, voice cool but razor sharp. You buried my name once. I rebuilt it from bones. She let the silence sink in. This time I'll bury yours, but not with rumors, with evidence. Rose's jaw twitched. Barely. But she caught it. You're making a mistake, he warned. They won't stand behind you when this explodes. Naomi stood slowly pushing the untouched wine away. Then I'll stand alone. She turned to leave. He called out once more, quieter now. You think they'll listen to you? She stopped at the edge of the table, eyes fixed ahead. They don't have to. They just need to hear me. And then she walked out. The door closed behind her and the soft music swallowed the last of her presence. Outside, her phone buzzed. It was Maya. He cracked on the stand. The tone's changing. You were right. It's happening. Naomi looked up at the sky. Let the empire shake. She was done asking for seats at the table. She was building her own. The courtroom carried a hush that wasn't just silence. It was something heavier. A weight in the air as if everyone inside had agreed to hold their breath at once. Judge Miles adjusted his robe, trying to look at ease, but his fingers fumbled slightly over the papers in front of him. Across the aisle, Officer Reese looked relaxed, bored, even tapping his fingers on the table like a man waiting for a bus he already knew would take him home. No one noticed Maya Ellis quietly stepping back from her chair. No one but Naomi. The clerk stood and read a name that hadn't been called since this trial began. Naomi Carter, special witness, authorized by the United States Department of Justice. The words hung for a moment before sinking into the room. Reese straightened. His eyes darted toward Maya, then back to Naomi as she rose from her seat. She didn't rush. She moved like someone who'd already walked through the worst of it and come out on the other side. Naomi took the stand, swore her oath with a voice that didn't shake, then turned to face the man who once rewrote her story with a lie. I wasn't just a bystander, she said, meeting Reese's stare. I was your victim. But not anymore. Her words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. Hard, precise, and permanent. She turned to the gallery and continued. I was 19 when Officer Reese arrested me outside the law library. He said I attacked him. I didn't. But that didn't stop the report, the cuffs, or the conviction. I lost everything because of that lie. My scholarship, my future, my name. Her voice dipped, just enough for the room to lean in. But I didn't stay buried. She looked to Maya, who approached the courtroom monitor and inserted a flash drive. A grainy video flickered to life. Reese's voice, cocky and careless, played through the speakers. I saved my badge with that arrest. Girl thought she was smart. Law student or something. I flipped the story, said she hit me. They bought it. Easy. The air snapped. Gasps scattered across the rows. A juror blinked, stunned. Reese's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Judge Miles barked back, trying to regain control. But the control was gone. It had slipped through his hands the moment Naomi said her name. Naomi kept going. We recovered financial records, she said, and Maya displayed them next. Showing direct payments to Judge Miles from the law firm that represented officers under misconduct review, including this one. The judge went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came. I also present a letter, Naomi said, lifting a sealed envelope from the United States Department of Justice, confirming my status as a federal investigator assigned to monitor this court for civil rights violations. She handed it to the bailiff. Let the record show, she continued now, turning toward the crowd. I was not placed here by accident. I was sent to expose exactly what you've all tried to keep hidden. For a beat, there was no sound but breathing. Reese's jaw clenched. His eyes darted around, searching for something solid to grab onto. He found nothing. Judge Miles opened the letter. His lips tightened as he read the seal. Behind Naomi, someone whispered, "It's real." Still, she didn't let the moment fall into celebration. They tried to take my voice, she said, but I learned to speak louder. Not just for myself, but for every name buried in forgotten files, every life altered by silence. A soft rustle stirred the courtroom as an elderly black woman in the gallery rose. She placed a hand over her heart and said not loudly, but clearly, "We see you now, and we hear you." Naomi's throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She stood taller and stepped down from the witness box. This time no one dared to laugh. They watched in silence, some ashamed, some awakened. The system had just been cracked wide open, and Naomi Carter was no longer standing in its shadow. She was standing in the light. For a full 5 seconds, there was no movement in the room, only the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then came the sound, sharp, furious. "She's lying. She's a criminal." Reese was on his feet, face flushed, voice cracking beneath the weight of panic. "She set this up. This whole damn thing is staged." The judge slammed his gavel, but Reese wouldn't stop. "You're all falling for it. She wants to bring the whole system down. You let her do this, and none of you are safe." He turned to the jury box, then to the gallery, searching for anyone to back him. Then a slow shuffle. A tall man stood from the second row. Calm, gray at the temples, a presence that didn't shout but carried weight. "I was there," Isaiah Brooks said, voice steady. "That's my voice on the tape. The day you bragged about setting her up, you were proud of it." Reese froze, his jaw twitched. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She just turned toward the judge, her voice measured clear. "You sentenced me for raising my voice," she said. "I wonder what you'll say now that I've found the words to fight back." Judge Miles's hand lingered over the gavel, but he didn't strike it. His fingers curled in slightly knuckles white. He was no longer in control. Not of the courtroom. Not of the truth. The prosecutor stood next, her voice cracking as she addressed the bench. "Given the evidence presented today, and the involvement of federal oversight, we recommend immediate suspension of these proceedings pending referral to the U.S. Department of Justice." Silence again, this time not from fear, from impact, from the collective realization that something irreversible had just begun. Judge Miles looked down at the folder in front of him, the seal of the DOJ on its cover. The courtroom, once his domain, now felt like a cage. He cleared his throat. "This court acknowledges the need for independent review. The current trial is hereby suspended. All case materials will be transferred to federal jurisdiction." The gavel came down, but softly, not with finality, with surrender. Gasps rippled through the gallery, some in disbelief, some in relief. Reese sat deflated. Miles leaned back in his chair, eyes glazed, as if trying to see a way out, and finding none. Naomi didn't smile. She just stood, collected her papers, and walked toward the back of the courtroom. Each step felt like history correcting itself. She didn't look back. The courtroom didn't erupt. It held its breath. No one moved. No one whispered. It was that rare kind of silence that didn't just fall, it settled. Heavy, knowing, inevitable. Then came the sound of the back doors opening. Firm, deliberate footsteps approached. 2 federal agents walked down the aisle, every pair of eyes locked on them as if watching something sacred break through. They didn't speak. They didn't ask for permission. They headed straight for Logan Reese. He stood up abruptly, voice cracking. "Wait, what is this? You don't understand. I was doing my job. I was protecting the force." The agents didn't respond. One reached for his wrist. "No, this isn't how it ends," Reese insisted, voice climbing with every word. "I made arrests. I kept order. She's lying." The cuffs clicked shut. Outside, the hum of the crowd became thunder. People had gathered, mothers, students, veterans, strangers holding signs, filming with their phones, some just standing with arms crossed and eyes wide open. The building that once stood as a symbol of silence now echoed with a roar for truth. But inside, Naomi didn't move. She sat still, steady. Her eyes weren't on Reese. They were fixed on the bench. Judge Miles hadn't spoken, hadn't blinked. Then another agent entered, this time holding a manila folder thick and weathered. He walked calmly to the bench and placed it down with care. 17 complaints. 17 names. 17 cases Judge Miles had sealed, dismissed, or rerouted into silence. "Judge Terrence Miles," the agent said, voice calm but charged with weight, "you are under investigation for obstruction of justice and willful suppression of internal review. You are requested to step down immediately." Miles sat in silence. For a moment he seemed smaller than the robe he wore. He looked out at the room, then at Naomi. "I followed protocol," he murmured, voice barely audible. Naomi finally spoke. "You sentenced me for raising my voice. I wonder what you'll say now that I've found the words to fight back." Miles didn't reply. He stood up slowly, When the agents took his arms, he didn't resist. He walked past Naomi without a glance. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the air between them. The man who once held the gavel had no words left. The woman he silenced had taken back the floor. News cameras caught everything. Outside, cheers erupted. They weren't just cheering for a courtroom victory. They were cheering because someone had refused to disappear. Because someone dared to turn the system back onto itself. In a high-rise office overlooking the state capitol, Clifford Rowe watched the footage unfold on a muted screen. He didn't blink. His jaw clenched. The lights in the office hummed faintly, the only sound breaking through the tension pressing into his chest. Then his phone rang. Naomi's name lit up at the screen. He hesitated, then answered. "You think this changes anything?" he said quietly. Naomi's voice came clear and unwavering. "I didn't have to expose you today," she said. "But trust me, tomorrow is mine." And with that, she hung up. Rowe didn't move. He just stared at the blank screen. Across the country, headlines spread like brushfire. Surprise witness was federal investigator. Judge Miles indicted in courtroom shock. One woman, 17 cases, a reckoning. Some students in law schools rewatched Naomi's testimony like a masterclass in justice. Veterans in church halls replayed her words, calling her brave. And in homes across the nation, older viewers leaned closer to their screens and whispered to no one in particular, about time. But Naomi, she went home, closed the door, sat by her kitchen window with a cup of tea. She wasn't done. She knew that. But for one night, the world had listened. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't belong to the system. It belonged to peace. A week had passed, quietly but not without consequence. Across the state, headlines shifted from distraction to accountability. Clifford Rowe resigned from office without a statement. The Department of Justice launched a statewide investigation into prosecutorial misconduct. People who had once felt invisible began calling their lawyers back, filing complaints again, whispering a little louder. Naomi Carter didn't attend a single press conference. She wasn't on the news. She didn't sit for interviews or wave from courthouse steps. While others were speaking into microphones, she was building something quieter and far more powerful. On a modest corner in Richmond, a sign went up, the Reclaim Project. Inside, the walls weren't lined with accolades. They were covered with photographs. Faces of those who had once been silenced, whose names never made it to court. Naomi didn't decorate with awards. She decorated with memory. She sat behind a wooden desk most mornings, wearing soft sweaters and listening more than she spoke. Some came to find out how to reopen their cases. Others just needed someone to believe them. One afternoon, a letter arrived in a plain envelope. No return address. The handwriting looked young, unsure. It read, "I thought I didn't matter until I saw you. You gave me back my voice." Naomi folded the letter carefully, her hands lingering for a moment. Then she slid it into a drawer already full of others just like it. That evening, she stayed late after the last client left. The building was quiet, bathed in the low gold light of dusk. She walked to a small frame on the back wall. It held a photo of herself from years ago, head down, wrists cuffed, jaw set. She studied it, not with anger, not with sorrow, just stillness. Then softly she said aloud to no one in particular, "Justice is not the end, it's the beginning." Outside, a city kept moving. A car passed. A door closed down the street. Somewhere, someone turned off a porch light. The world didn't pause, but this small room did, because this room remembered. It remembered the woman who once sat in a courtroom while others laughed at her. It remembered how she returned not to punish, but to reveal. Not to scream, but to let the truth speak clearly in its own time. And even long after Naomi turned off the lights and locked the door behind her, something stayed behind. A stillness, a strength, not the kind you shout about, the kind that lasts. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful journey. Naomi's story reminds us that justice isn't always loud, and it rarely comes easy. Sometimes it begins in silence, grows through pain, and rises in the quiet courage to return where you were once broken and speak. What Naomi did wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about reclaiming dignity for herself and for every voice that was ever dismissed, ignored, or erased. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories for more true-to-life stories that shine a light on injustice, hope, and human strength. Your support means everything to us. Every view, every comment, every click helps our small creative team continue to tell stories that matter, stories that remember. Because at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell what happened. We help the world remember what should never be forgotten. The officer didn't raise his voice. He simply struck the 16-year-old black boy across the face right in front of the judge. The courtroom froze. The boy didn't cry. He didn't shout. He wiped the blood from his lip, then looked toward the door because his father had just stepped through the door. And suddenly everything changed. What would you do if someone slapped your child right there in court? This father didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just walked in and changed everything without saying a word. Comment below because sometimes silence is the loudest answer. You could feel it the moment you stepped into that courtroom. It wasn't just the silence. It was the weight of eyes that had already decided. They stared before he even sat down. A 16-year-old black boy wrist-cuffed walked in flanked by 2 deputies. Not a word from him, not a tear, just quiet steps on a polished floor that suddenly felt too loud. Someone behind me whispered, "He must have done something bad." And just like that, he was guilty to the room. Officer Doyle took the stand like he'd done it 100 times. Calm, sure of himself. He didn't glance at the boy. Didn't need to. He had the badge, the bench behind him, the wind at his back. He laid it out smoothly. He resisted, got mouthy. I had to restrain him like he was reading a weather report. The judge nodded, barely looked up. That nod. That was the real sentence. You could feel the air get heavier. The boy just sat there still, not stiff, not scared, just like he'd done this before. His hands rested in his lap, eyes focused, not flinching. He looked at Doyle, and for a moment, just a flicker, he tilted his head. Then asked quietly, "Is this your idea of law?" No threat, no attitude, just a question. But it landed like a slap. Doyle froze for half a second, then walked down from the stand. 1 step, then 2. And right there in front of the judge, without warning, he backhanded that boy across the face. You could hear the shock ripple, a gasp, a stifled cry, but no one moved. Not the bailiff, not the judge. Just silence. The boy didn't cry, didn't raise his voice. He slowly brought his hand up, wiped the blood from his lip, and smiled. Then he looked Doyle in the eye, steady and unshaken, and said, "You just made a mistake you'll regret forever." Not loud, but it rang louder than any gavel in that room. The slap had landed, but the boy, he didn't fall apart. He didn't even react the way people expected him to. No tears, no shouting, just a stillness, the kind that makes a room nervous, as if he knew this wasn't the worst part. They called a recess. People murmured, shifted. The judge stepped out without a glance. And then they brought in the court-appointed defense. Nina Ford, not new to this building, not new to kids being thrown into it. She walked over quietly, heels clicking soft against tile, and crouched beside the boy, careful not to crowd him. "I'm Nina. They've asked me to represent you. Can you tell me your name?" He glanced sideways, slow, measured. And for the first time since he walked in, he spoke. Names don't mean anything in here. There was no attitude in his voice, no defiance, just experience, like someone who'd seen this place chew up names before. Nina studied him. He didn't look scared, not even angry, just heavy, like something was sitting on him that no one else could see. "Still," she said gently, "I'd like to know what to call you." A pause, then a breath. Jalen Carter." She jotted it down, ran it through her notes. No priors, no red flags. But that only made her more curious, because something about this boy didn't match the paperwork. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't defensive. His body didn't speak fear, it spoke control, the kind that's taught, not born. And that's when she noticed it, a thin silver chain tucked beneath the collar of his shirt. Not flashy, not for show, just something he wore close, almost like it wasn't for anyone else to see. Nina didn't mean to look, but it caught the light as he adjusted his seat. So she leaned ever so slightly, and her eyes caught the engraving. "Carter, Field Office, FBI." Her breath stopped. She didn't say anything. Not yet. Just looked back at him. He saw it in her eyes, knew she'd read it. And without a word, he reached up, tucked the chain back into his shirt, and turned away. Not hiding, just done explaining. "Whatever you think that means," he said, voice low. "It doesn't change how they see me in here." That was the moment she realized he wasn't trying to win this case. He was just trying to survive it. They say court recess is for catching your breath. But for Jalen, it was just the next round. The judge had stepped out. Most folks drifted into quiet talk, tapping phones, sipping coffee from paper cups. But the boy, he sat alone at the defense table, still cuffed. And that's when two officers walked over. Not quick, not loud, just casual, like they'd done it a dozen times before. "We're doing a drug sweep," one of them said flatly. "Protocol. Protocol." Right there in the middle of the courtroom, they yanked open his backpack, tore through his notebooks, dumped out his pens, unzipped every pocket like they were sure something was hiding. Even pulled out a sandwich wrapped in foil, tossed it aside like trash. And he just sat there, watching them tear through the pieces of a life already judged. Nina stood up fast. "He's not under arrest for possession. You have no grounds to," but they cut her off. "Ma'am, we're doing our job. You can file a complaint later. Later. Always later." That word was a brick wall they threw up every time you tried to breathe. One of the officers scribbled something onto a clipboard, tore off the sheet, slapped it down beside the mess. "Suspicious behavior, filed. No drugs, no anything, but still a mark." Jalen didn't move, didn't protest. He reached over slowly and packed his things back into the backpack, one by one, carefully, like it was muscle memory. That's when the second officer, a younger one, maybe mid-30s, leaned toward his partner and muttered loud enough for us all to hear. "Look at him, a future inmate, not a student." Time didn't stop, but hearts did. Even Nina froze. And Jalen, he just zipped the bag shut and kept his eyes low, as if he knew this part by heart. Then Doyle stepped back in, arms crossed, that same crooked smile. He tossed a folded sheet onto the judge's bench and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to add resisting arrest and obstruction to the report. The defendant became uncooperative during transport." Simons barely looked at the paper. Didn't ask a question, didn't ask the boy. He simply adjusted his glasses and clicked his pen. "Charges noted, added to the docket." Just like that. And then he said it, so calm, so bureaucratic, like he was adding ketchup to an order that was already coming. Sometimes you have to treat them like what they'll become. The room didn't gasp this time, because they weren't surprised. Only sickened. Nina clenched her jaw. The boy didn't flinch. And I remember sitting there thinking, he wasn't just on trial, he was being told who he was allowed to become. By the time court resumed, Nina was ready. She'd been quiet through the last break, but anyone watching her could see something had shifted. Not fear, not panic, focus. She walked to the center of the courtroom with a flash drive in her hand, the way a surgeon might hold a scalpel. There was no trembling, no big speech. "Your Honor," she began, voice steady. "I have new evidence recorded from a civilian security camera on the corner of Darrow and 5th. The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. "It shows the incident Officer Doyle described, and it tells a very different story." She handed the flash drive to the clerk, who plugged it into the court's monitor. The screen blinked. Then the footage played. It wasn't crystal clear, but it didn't have to be. There in the grainy video was Jalen, standing between Officer Doyle and an elderly black man who looked terrified and confused. The man had a cane, moved slowly, was saying something inaudible but pleading. Doyle shoved him, hard. The man stumbled backward, and Jalen, just a kid, caught him. He didn't throw a punch, didn't yell. He simply stood between them, holding out both arms like a human shield. That was it. And in that moment, you could feel the room stop breathing. Even a few jurors leaned forward. It was clear, too clear. Nina looked to the judge. "This footage contradicts Officer Doyle's sworn statement, and it shows that my client acted to prevent harm, not cause it." For a moment, it felt like something had cracked open. Like maybe today would be different. But then Judge Simons leaned back, removed his glasses, wiped them, and said without looking up, "Unverified footage. Dismissed. No explanation. No pause." Just like that, the truth was filed away as irrelevant. You could hear it, that sound a room makes when hope falls flat on the floor. Not a gasp, not a cry, just disappointment. Like watching someone bury a body they swore they'd protect. Nina stood frozen for half a second. But Doyle smiled, wider than he had all morning. "It's always not their fault," he said, "until they're in handcuffs." That was when Jalen looked up. For the first time since that slap, he lifted his head and spoke. Quiet, not for show, but with weight. "You're not the first to bury the truth, but I might be the last to stay buried." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They just landed. And that was when it started. The shifting in the seats, the murmurs, the tightening in the chest of every person who'd ever seen someone like him pushed down and told to stay there. People weren't just watching anymore. They were feeling. They were angry. But the boy, he went quiet again, hands folded, eyes steady. And for the first time, the courtroom wasn't judging him. It was watching him. After the footage was dismissed, Nina sat back down, but she didn't let it go. She kept her eyes on Jalen, trying to read the silence he wore like a second skin. He hadn't looked angry, hadn't slouched, hadn't even blinked when the judge waved the truth away like dust on a windowsill. But something had shifted. You could feel it. Nina leaned toward him, not to push, just to let him know she was still there. That's when he slid a folded piece of paper toward her. No eye contact, no urgency. She opened it, one line, written neat. Watch, don't act, not yet. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a question, it was direction. And for a split second, she wasn't sure who was defending whom. Then she noticed it the way he adjusted his sleeve. Slow, deliberate, revealing the watch beneath. At first glance, nothing unusual, a plain black band metal clasp digital face. But Nina had seen it before. Exactly that model. Issued by the Bureau to family members of agents working in volatile assignments. One tap could send a signal, 2 taps could send more. She said nothing, just looked at him. And he didn't return the glance, just leaned back. Calm, still. Like he knew exactly how much time was left on the clock. Somewhere in the back row, a man shifted in his seat. Not loudly, not nervously. He sat in the corner, a few rows behind the press box, dark suit, no tie back straight, hands clasped gently in front of him. His eyes never left Jalen, not once. Most wouldn't notice him, but if you did, you'd realize something right away. He wasn't watching out of concern. He was watching like someone waiting for confirmation. Marcus Carter had just entered the story, but the room didn't know it yet. And the boy, he didn't look back. Didn't need to. Because silence when chosen is louder than any outburst. And sometimes staying still is how you prepare to turn everything. You could tell Doyle thought the courtroom was his again. He leaned back against the rail with that familiar smirk, the kind that came from knowing no one would stop him. Not here, not now, not with that badge. The video had been tossed, the truth buried again. And the boy still sitting there, still silent, still cuffed. So Doyle did what men like him always do when they think the story's done. He taunted. No one's here to save you, boy. He didn't shout it. Didn't need to. He said it with the kind of ease that meant he believed it. Believed it so deeply, he didn't even look around first. And for a heartbeat, he was right. Nobody moved. Not the judge, not the bailiff, not the crowd, until one chair scraped softly at the very back of the room. You could barely hear it, but the silence made it loud. A man stood, slow, composed, wearing a dark suit, no-tie clean white shirt, the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself, but takes over the room by existing. He walked down the aisle, not rushed, not hesitant, like he belonged there, like he knew exactly where this path led. Some folks turned, others stared, but the boy didn't move, not even to glance back, because he knew, he'd known. The man reached the front row, paused, then stepped into the open space between the gallery and the bar. And in a voice firm but low, so low it made everyone lean in, he said, "I am." Just 2 words. But they cut clean through the courtroom like a sharp wind through glass. Doyle blinked, stiffened, then straightened his shoulders, trying to hold on to whatever authority he thought he still had. But the man was already reaching into his jacket, pulled out a leather badge case, slow, intentional. He flipped it open. Gold glinted under the courtroom lights. Not loud, but final. Marcus Carter, Deputy Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words hit like thunder, muffled in velvet. No shouting, no drama. Just truth presented plainly. There was a pause, not in the sentence, but in the air. A deep, stretched silence, like the room needed time to understand what it had just heard. Then it happened. One juror shifted, jaw clenched. A reporter dropped her pen. The court clerk looked up, confused, and the judge, he froze. Doyle didn't speak. His face said enough. Because in that moment, the balance tilted. Everything he'd built, the smirks, the power, the comfort, slipped. Marcus didn't look at him, not yet. He turned his gaze, slow, deliberate, to Judge Simons, eyes steady, shoulders squared. And then softly, with the weight of law behind every syllable, "You silenced my son." A pause, not for effect, for clarity. Now you'll hear the sound of accountability. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a performance. It was a fact, undeniable, unstoppable. Judge Simons didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stared back, pale. Jalen turned slightly in his seat, still cuffed, still grounded. He looked over his shoulder, not surprised, not smug, and smiled, just a faint curl of the lips, a moment of softness beneath all that silence. Then, barely loud enough for Nina to hear, he said, "Told you someone would notice." No one else spoke, no one dared. because for the first time since the boy had entered that room, he wasn't the one being watched anymore. The room was still reeling. But Marcus Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, not as a father pleading, but as a man who knew the weight of law and how to use it. "Your Honor," he said calmly, eyes locked on Simons, "I am formally requesting a special evidentiary hearing." There was a pause. You could feel it. Simons looked down at the bench, then back at Marcus, trying to keep composure. "On what grounds?" Marcus didn't blink. "On grounds of prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias, and falsification of testimony by Officer Doyle." And just like that, the mood shifted. Nina stood, voice clear and precise. "Your Honor, we are submitting verified footage. It has been reviewed and authenticated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It confirms that my client, Jalen Carter, intervened to prevent excessive force being used against an unarmed civilian." A hush fell over the room again as the screen lit up. Same video, but now with an official stamped time code and FBI watermark. You could see Doyle in the corner of the frame, shoving the old man. Jalen stepping in, protecting. There was no mistaking it. And when the video ended, Marcus pulled out another folder, thicker, heavier. He handed it to the clerk. "These are internal affairs documents," he said. 3 separate incidents over the last 5 years involving Officer Doyle, each one flagged for misconduct, each one buried. He looked directly at Simons. "All 3 cases were scheduled for judicial review. All 3 were dismissed in pretrial hearings by you." Simons stiffened. His hand hovered over his gavel, but he didn't strike it. Couldn't, because this wasn't a courtroom anymore. Not really. It was a reckoning. Marcus took one final step forward. "By order of federal authority," he said louder now. "Firm, Officer Doyle, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and falsifying official records." Gasps. A flash of motion. 2 federal agents in suits appeared at the side door, stepping into view like shadows called forward by truth. Doyle tried to speak, mouth open, but no sound came. The cuffs went on. Not fast, not rough, just final. In front of everyone. In front of the judge. In front of the boy he thought was powerless. Simon sat frozen, the color draining from his face. He looked at Marcus, then at Nina, then at Jalen. But he didn't say a word. Didn't defend himself, didn't apologize. Just lowered his gaze and said nothing at all. Because sometimes silence isn't power. Sometimes it's surrender. The moment the cuffs clicked, phones went up. Quietly at first, then all at once. The sound of video recordings filled the room like rainfall after a drought. Within minutes, the footage was online. A shaky clip of Officer Doyle being arrested, hands behind his back, face pale as chalk. The caption read, "Fiesta Justice for Jalen." It started small, a few dozen retweets, a handful of TikToks. Then it grew. By noon, it was everywhere. News anchors replayed the moment. Facebook Live comments poured in. TikTok duets, Twitter threads, hashtags stacked one over another. "Justice for Jalen, #silence, is power. Shy, watch the courtroom fall." What happened inside of that courtroom was no longer confined to 4 walls. It spilled out into living rooms and feeds and dinner tables. People weren't just watching. They were remembering. They were recognizing. Some in disbelief, others in pain, but most with a sense of something long overdue finally catching up. In the gallery, an older black woman stood up slowly. She hadn't spoken all day. But now as agents led Doyle out in cuffs, she whispered under her breath. He didn't raise his voice, but his silence hit louder than any gavel. And she was right, because Jalen didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just waited. And when the truth showed up, he met it like he'd been expecting it the whole time. That clip of him smiling right before the arrest, that smile became a symbol. A screenshot, a movement. The FBI responded swiftly. An internal review was announced. All judicial decisions made by Judge Simons over the past 5 years would be re-examined. The dominoes had started falling, not out of rage, but out of silence finally being heard. And for once, justice didn't have to scream to be felt. The doors of the courthouse opened and the world was waiting. Camera flashes, reporters leaning forward with microphones. A line of questions shouted over each other, all blending into a kind of frantic noise. But Jalen didn't rush. He stepped out slowly beside his father, blinking into the daylight like it didn't surprise him. Someone from the front, a young female reporter, pushed her voice above the rest. "Why didn't you speak up sooner?" Jalen paused, not to think, just to let the noise settle around the silence he was about to offer. Then he said softly, "Because when justice speaks for you, you don't need to yell." It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't defiance. It was the kind of answer that only comes from someone who has learned to listen to the weight of his own silence and found power in it. Marcus stood beside him, hands still, shoulders tall. He looked over at his son, not as a deputy director, not as a man of title or authority, just as a father who had missed too many moments that mattered. Then he spoke, just loud enough for Jalen to hear. I missed your childhood, but I won't miss your courage. Jalen didn't reply. He just nodded once. And they walked. No hand on shoulder, no arms linked. Just two men, father and son, moving side by side, step for step, not toward a press conference, not toward a headline, but toward a different kind of history. Behind them, someone started clapping, then another, and soon the sound swelled, not like a stadium, but like respect rising up from the sidewalk. Warm, quiet, proud. They didn't wave, didn't stop, because this wasn't about the crowd. It was about every boy who'd been told to sit down, every father who thought he'd waited too long, every truth that had been buried beneath uniforms and silence, and now was walking free. They silenced a boy, but they awakened a generation. If this story moved you, even just a little, then maybe it's because deep down we all want to believe that silence can still speak volumes and that dignity can still change the room. Jalen didn't fight with noise. He stood with purpose. And in doing so, he reminded us justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly and stands tall. If you believe in stories that matter, stories that reflect courage, truth, and quiet power, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more stories that speak to the heart. Your support means everything to us. Every view, every comment, every share, it fuels the work we do and reminds us why we do it. Because here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories. We tell the kind of stories people remember. The kind that sit with you long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for walking this journey with us.